This is a special report from BRRVS News.
Good evening. I'm Stanley Huynh of the BRRVS News. Today, we have a special update surrounding the Iran hostage crisis. During 1979, Iran was attempting to overthrow the ruling monarchy. The Iranian Shah, former monarch, had fled Iran to the United States, being protected. Islamic revolutionaries demanded the Shah to be returned for trial and execution, but the United States refused to do so. Due to the refusal, the militant students attacked the American embassy and had taken more than 60 American hostage to Tehran, capital of Iran, both diplomats and citizens, with 6 Americans who were able to flee. The Americans were held for 444 days, from November 4th, 1979 to January 20th, 1981. Ken Taylor and John Sheridan, the top Canadian officials in Iran, were called upon by these Americans for help, and they did not hesitate. Immediately, the staff of the Canadian embassy on the day of the hostage were seized. 6 American diplomats evaded capture and remained in the hiding of the home of the Canadian diplomat John Sheridan, under the protection of the Canadian ambassador, Ken Taylor. In late 1979, the government of Prime Minister Joe Clark secretly issued an order in the Council for a special session of Parliament in Ottawa, which granted Canadian passports and driver license to be issued to some of American citizens. With new identification papers, the Americans successfully escaped out of the country. The significance of this event has changed the political and diplomatic landscape between the United States and Iran for decades to come. But we'll keep you updated as the story develops. Now on to Brayden Lai, reporting with new information surrounding the recent Vietnam War.
Vietnam of 1954, Vietnam was ruled as a French colony. During World War II, Vietnam's colony was also being occupied by Japanese forces, and the French wanted to retain control. But then Ho Chi Minh, the former Prime Minister of Vietnam, led an independent movement which was gaining strength, and the French was kicked out in 1954. Then in 1965, American troops invaded Vietnam and bombed the north side of Vietnam, but were not able to win the war. After all, the Americans surrendered, and the North and South Vietnam emerged as victory. Canada's response was they had 30,000 Canadians to fight under the American flag. They also contributed $2.47 billion worth of war material. After all, the Canadian government decided to keep the Canadian troops at home. The significance of this war was after the French were kicked out, Vietnam were divided into 2 different territories. Ho Chi Minh taking over North Vietnam, and South Vietnam was being monitored by the government in the US. Then they became the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in 1976 after the Americans failed to take over Vietnam's territory. We'll be back shortly with Richard Chi.
It is in times like these where the fate of the world is in jeopardy. However, in the likes of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have never been so close to full-on nuclear warfare. A year following the United States' attempt to overthrow the Castro regime in 1961, the Soviets began to secretly transport nuclear weapons to Cuba. Luckily, American spy planes discovered that this was happening, and the late John F. Kennedy responded accordingly. A naval blockade was established around Cuba to prevent any more Soviet ships from making it to Cuba. John F. Kennedy demanded that an American attack was imminent if the weapons were not removed from Cuba, and the Soviets promised to retaliate in response. Despite the NATO and NORAD mutual protection agreements, Prime Minister at the time, John Diefenbaker, refused to put Canadian troops on alert. Anyways, it wasn't long before the Soviets turned their ships around and removed all nuclear weapons from Cuba, in exchange for the United States to withdraw their nuclear weapons from Turkey and Italy. This confrontation lasted from October 16 to October 28, 1962, and it had relaxed the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The growing nuclear arsenals, as well as the tensions between the two, were some of the reasons of how this event happened. Despite this being the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, it saw the formation of a new relationship between Cuba and Canada. Canada has become one of the first non-Soviet countries to trade with Cuba, and Cuba has become a very popular vacation spot for Canadians. Even our Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, also seems to be on good terms with the President of Cuba himself, Fidel Castro. The Cuban Missile Crisis was also significant in many ways. It helped relax the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. A cordial relationship was also formed between Canada and Cuba, despite the recent opinions of those who opposed this friendship. And most importantly, no atomic bombs were dropped, and to this day, the world has never been closer to a full-scale nuclear war.
Thanks, Richard. Today marks the 22nd anniversary of the cancellation of the Avro Arrow. The Avro Arrow was an aircraft used for defensive purposes against the Soviet Union attacks. although this cancellation occurred in 1959, when the money costs increased rapidly throughout the years of building. 15,000 jobs were lost because of this aircraft cancellation.
This is an image of the Avro Arrow being built. It's a shame to see Canada's most expensive and advanced aircraft go to scrap metal. This was very important to us Canadians because this could have been a way to protect ourselves without the help from the USA. And now we have broadcast footage of the Korean War.
The year is 1950. War had just broken out. Far east, in the country of Korea, a conflict has brewed up for the past 10 years, slowly waiting to burst out. On June 25th, 1950, North Korean troops under orders marched across South Korean borders, launching a war that will last 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days. Coming to South Korea's aid, the UN being led by the Americans, under the command of General MacArthur, came to support the struggling South Korean army. The initial defense force consisted of not only the USA, but also Britain and its partner countries, such as Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. With new allies, the defense force managed to push the communists back to the Yalu River, located near the Korea-China border. With the Chinese fearing an attack, they joined in the offense, and with the Soviets by their side, they managed to force the UN forces into full retreat. This retreat lasted until mid-1951, and because of the constant pushing back and forth, the capital city of Seoul changed hands 4 times during the war. Another new invention was jet aircraft combat, and American and Soviet pilots dueling it out in the sky. It marked the first time that jet aircraft were used in full-scale air combat. But finally, on June 27, 1953, after 36,914 deaths, a formal ceasefire was called and an armistice was signed, marking the end of a conflict that killed tens of thousands, wounded hundreds of thousands, and displaced many civilians in farms and in towns. Although an armistice was signed, there has not come a formal peace treaty that officially marks the end, but maybe someday there will.